I've heard people say that had he lived, we might have never heard of George Washington today. I don't know if that's true or not, but yeah, because he might have been made the overall commander, but alas, that's not how things worked out. He instead is killed. And as I said, the British bayoneted some of the wounded to death. The British were not messing around. They were not always chivalrous and kind, and they weren't good sports.
I think, James, a long time ago, you requested I do a mini episode on the training of a soldier in the Revolutionary period versus the modern military. Yes. A modern soldier would absolutely obliterate a revolutionary soldier. They're trained in hand-to-hand combat weapons. Yeah. They're in better shape. The few ways that a soldier in this period would be trained, they would know how to load a weapon. They would fire about as quickly as you could, 3 shots a minute. They would also study bayonet fencing because there was an understanding that with close quarter combat, this is what you would use. So for all the lack of professionalism in some aspects, the lack of physical conditioning these soldiers would have, they would have proficiency on how to bayonet someone to death. So this is horrific. I just want to underline that if you didn't already enough.
Yeah, and we're going to see examples in the future of people being bayoneted 5, 6, 7 times or even more. It's the British, like I said, they don't mess around with those bayonets. They know, as you said, they know what to do and they use them. They're not afraid to use them, as the saying says. So the battle ends in a British victory. The British are the victors. They're the winner of the battle because they, at the end of the battle, they hold the field of battle. The Americans had to retreat. But it's a very costly, very, very costly victory, Scott.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
All right. So shall we go straight into the aftermath?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. The Americans left 140 dead, 271 wounded, and 30 missing. And one of the casualties, as I mentioned, was Major General Joseph Warren. So a very high-ranking officer, although he was just brand new. He had just gotten his commission. The British, I think they wanted to pursue the Americans further west, but they were too exhausted. They lost 226 dead and 828 wounded. And of the wounded, about 250 would die of their wounds. So we're talking, what is that? I do a little math here. Over 1,000 casualties, and about 500 almost are going to end up dead. So the British losses were almost 50% of their initial strength. That is a huge casualty rate. When we went through our Civil War series, I believe the highest casualty rate we saw was 33%. I think it was which battle was that? It was like Stones River or Murfreesboro, or I don't know. It was one of the ones in Tennessee. I've forgotten. I've read so much Revolutionary War that I forgot some of the details. But so if you think about as bloody as the Civil War was, the highest casualty rate as a percentage was 33%. Well, here the British lose 50%. So can you say Pyrrhic victory, Scott?
Yeah, that's ugly. And I would just like to take a moment here to highlight something you mentioned and not skip over, because this could maybe broaden our perspective on history or military history. You're absolutely right. That's a very high casualty rate, but think about that, 50%, and it's rare to get that high. One of the greatest victories of the French in the 100 Years' War with the British was the Battle of Agincourt. Or I'm sorry, that was the British victory of 30 to 50% of French soldiers. Warfare, it's not the type of thing where every last man is wiped out like a Battle of Thermopylae. That really doesn't happen. I mean, very, very rare situations, and we know of them because they're so rare. And that's because, as we saw in this battle, and in almost all battles we can think of militarily, the point isn't to, spill the blood of every last man on the soil. As a general or as a commander, your goal is to win. And you weaken an army, or you weaken it until it loses formation. Then it'll retreat. Maybe you can catch them in a rout, or at least force them into a retreat. Maybe they surrender. You don't want to wipe them off the face of the earth. The cases where you see the highest amounts of casualties, this is one example, but when soldiers run away and it gets into a rout, that's where you see the highest amount of casualties happen. And the reason more patriots didn't die is because it wasn't. Fun fact, I read something by this blogger on military affairs named John Davis, who said, at boot camp, the reason soldiers are yelled at so much by officers It's partly discipline, yes, but it's also to rewire your brain so that you don't immediately trigger into a fight or flight response when something sudden and eruptive happens at you, whether it's a drill sergeant screaming in your face or it's gunfire going off. And ultimately, you're trained when you're attacked to run toward the source of the fire, and you actually have a better chance of surviving. That goes against every hardwired instinct you have as a human being. Your instinct is to run away, but you're reprogrammed in boot camp to get away from it so you don't get into a rout-like situation and have those high casualty numbers. So that's my little meta commentary, but let's come back down to earth. Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a very short break for a word from our sponsors.
Yeah, that's interesting, Scott. I didn't know that about the yelling, and so you get used to loud noises and chaos and disruption and you train yourself not to run away. When I went and got my first master's degree, there was a guy in one of my classes, and he'd been in the Navy, and we were talking about the military, and he said, I don't know why they always think you have to yell to motivate people. Why do they always yell? And so now I know the answer.
Right. There's live fire exercises, but yelling is cheaper and it's omnipresent, and it's a great way to let off steam if you're a drill sergeant. So it's just more effective. Yeah, it's too bad I'm not in contact with this guy anymore. I could say, hey, Dr. Scott Rank said such and such. Anyway, all right. So regarding the casualties, General Howe, of course, he was the leader of the attack. He said, the success is too dearly bought. And General Gage, who was in overall command, he had stayed behind in Boston. He wrote, the trials we have had to show that the rebels are not, I'm sorry, let me reemphasize that. The trials we have had show that the rebels are not the despicable rabble too many have supposed them to be. In all their wars against the French, they never showed so much conduct, attention, and perseverance as they do now. In other words, in modern parlance, Gage is saying these guys they're not wimps. They're tougher than we thought they were. We're braver than the French, ladies and gentlemen. Absolutely. Yeah. Why didn't they fight like this against the French? They're fighting. They're giving us everything they got. One of the American commanders, at this point, he's just a brigadier general of militia, New Hampshire militia, a man named Nathaniel Greene. He's going to have a big future. We'll talk a lot about Greene in the future. But at this point, Greene says he was at the battle. He said, I wish we could sell them another hill at the same price. In other words, yeah, you want another hill? That's fine. We'll take another 1,000 guys with us. The carnage shocked everyone, even battle-hardened veterans, people like Gage and Howe. They just couldn't believe how fiercely the Americans had fought. It helped that they were behind fortifications, but it wasn't just the fortifications. There was a fighting spirit that the British just had not seen coming. The Americans also learned a valuable lesson about the importance of supply lines. Yes. You've got to have a clear chain of supplies coming to you, or you might run out of ammo. Imagine, Scott, if the Americans had not run out of ammo, we might be talking about American victory at this point. And another thing about this battle, Bunker Hill or Breed's Hill, if you prefer, it was the most costly battle of the entire war for the British in terms of the number killed and wounded. So obviously the British don't know this at the time, nor do the Americans. But looking back on it, we can say the British would never lose this many men again in another battle. And there's going to be a lot of battles. Yeah, and another aspect of this, there's a difference with how the Patriots fight in this battle versus Lexington and Concord. And that has to do with the leadership that they had. One thing is that the marksmanship is much better than the retreat from Concord. Couldn't be much worse. That'd be almost impossible. But part of the reason is that the troops are fighting in tight formations, and they're commanded by competent officers that help direct what they're doing. Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes. They have competent instruction. If they wouldn't have had that, then there could have been skittish firing when they're still a couple of 100 feet off, and we wouldn't have been talking about this costly victory. But a large number of the men in various militia organizations had backed away from the fight or chosen not to engage, as you mentioned, where many don't come back after the initial bombardment. A lot of the officers on the Patriot side are still untrained. Despite that, the officers here, the Patriot officers, have been given a very difficult task and did excellent under the circumstances, I would say, due to them almost achieving victory and the British having to fight a Pyrrhic victory. Like you said, it was due to supply problems, lack of ammunition, and it took some time to sort out good officers from the bad, kind of like the Union Army in the Civil War. So what happens next? Does the army get whipped into shape?
Yeah, it's about time to get organized. The Patriots realized it's not going to cut it just to have a bunch of individual militia units. We need a real army. We need a professional army along the lines of the British Army. So this is actually before Bunker Hill. This is 3 days before. Battle of Bunker Hill takes place on June 17th, 1775. 3 days before that, down in Philadelphia on June 14th, the Congress voted to establish a Continental Army. So this is the beginning, the birth of the U.S. Army, or what would become the U.S. Army, for purposes of common defense and to fight the British. And so they adopted the forces already in place outside of Boston and New York. At the same time as this, the authorities, the new Patriot civilian authorities in New England, they yield control. So they surrender control of the troops around Boston and New York to the Continental Congress. So again, the Continental Congress is basically going to be the government. The government's going to be very, well, should I give that away? I'll go ahead and give it away. The Congress is really going to struggle. They're going to have they're not going to be the most effective government ever in the history of the world. I mean, they'll basically get the job done, but there's going to be a lot of issues and problems that we're going to have. There's no president. There's no executive. There's no judiciary branch. There's just the Congress. There's going to be a committee that gives their orders to the army. There's no single commander in chief like we have today in the president. The Congress also votes to raise 10 companies of Continental troops on a 1-year enlistment. That was very optimistic. They also recruit riflemen from Pennsylvania, Maryland, Delaware, and Virginia to be used as light infantry, and they became the first Continental Regiment later on. And again, you do have, we talked earlier about how the overwhelming majority of soldiers in the Revolutionary War on both sides they used regular muskets, smoothbore muskets with a limited range. However, there are some riflemen. Rifles had been invented. The reason they weren't the standard issue weapon is because they were very hard to load. It was slow, much slower than a smoothbore musket, and the gunpowder would get stuck on the inside of the barrel, and it would take sometimes you have to clean them out, and you could have accidents. So rifles are around, and they do have a longer range, but they're just too high maintenance, Scott. They're just too much of a pain. But nevertheless, there will be units of riflemen, and we'll talk about a couple of famous ones later. And then on June 15th, 1775, 2 days before Bunker Hill, the Congress elected by unanimous vote George Washington as commander-in-chief. Washington, when he arrived at the Continental Congress, when he went to the first meeting, he wore his old Virginia militia uniform. He didn't show up in civilian clothes. He walks in a military uniform. It's almost as if he's saying, ooh, pick me. Advertising his services. At least that's my interpretation of it. So George Washington is chosen to be commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. He accepted, and he served throughout the war without any compensation. He refused a salary. He said, if you'll just pay me back for my expenses, then I'll be happy. And he's going to run up a tab of thousands of pounds over the course of the war. But anyway, so there you go. John Adams was the one who nominated him. And when they do that in the John Adams miniseries, I think it's very accurate the way they portrayed that. So he's going to be lieutenant general. Again, they're not going to have any full generals like 4-star. You won't have any of those until Ulysses S. Grant way later. But so Lieutenant General Washington is the head honcho, and then under him you're going to have 4 major generals. Later that will be expanded, but we start with Artemus Ward, who had been he's just about to be in the process of fighting Bunker Hill. He's the overall commander at Bunker Hill. A fellow named Charles Lee, and we will have much to say about Charles Lee. He's a piece of work. Do y'all have that phrase in where you live, Scott?
Yeah, it's I like to think of when a police officer is describing a juvenile delinquent.
Yeah.
He has a very interesting there's a lot. We'll get into
It's
it.
a polite way of saying he's a mess, or he